Hey you guys, and welcome to my bite-sized guide for Shadow Priest in the War Within. This is a quick overview just to get you started with covering the main basics for everything you need to know about Shadow Priest. I'm not a Simcraft guy with all the numbers laid out in front of me, so it's not going to be a super advanced guide, and with tuning still ongoing until Season 1 starts, it's kind of pointless doing that anyway. But let's get straight into it. First things first, we've got two new hero talent specs in the War Within, Archon and Void Weaver. With Archon, the star of the show is your Halo. Through the talents Power Surge and Divine Halo, Halo hits a total of 6 times, combined with Energy Compression making it do 30% more damage, Resonant Energy making enemies take up to 10% more damage from you, and generating Surge of Insanity procs through Manifested Power that are empowered by Empowered Surges, which make Mindflay Insanity do some crazy damage. With Archon, you get so much value out of pressing Halo, and it's only on a 1-minute cooldown. We then also see our usual cooldowns empowered. Concentrated Infusion gives our PI 10% more haste. This is only for the priest casting it and not to the other person that you use PI on. Perfected Form makes Dark Ascension give you 12% more damage and Void Form give you another 20% damage. Having all of these cooldowns empowered means that we've essentially got some amazing alternating DPS windows, an absolutely huge opener and 2-minute window from then on with all of our cooldowns, and then in between that we've got a 1-minute window with just our Halo by itself. This provides Archon with some pretty fantastic versatility, and a lot of our skill expression is going to come from knowing when to time that 2-minute window correctly, so that you've got everything available for the biggest pulls to maximize your overall DPS in Mythic Plus, or for taking down the highest priority targets in both Mythic Plus and Raid. As a pretty awesome bonus with Archon, you also get 5% more stamina from Power Word Fortitude, though bear in mind that is only for the priest, it's not for the entire party or raid. With Void Weaver, we see a very different approach, with the gameplay loop centering around Void Torrent. When we cast Void Torrent, we create a slow-moving entropic rift that locks onto and follows the enemy that we cast the Void Torrent on, and this rift deals damage to all enemies within it every 0.8 seconds. While the rift is active, we see our Mind Blast get transformed into Void Blast, essentially just Mind Blast but with a very cool animation, new audio feedback that sounds incredible, it hits way harder and it generates more insanity. We also deal 10% more shadow damage overall while the rift is active through the Void Heart talent. Our Vampiric Touch and Shadow of Pain deal 20% more damage through the Inner Quietus talent. Our Shadow Fiend can transform into an upgraded Void Wraith. Our Shadow of Death becomes empowered against targets with Absorb Shields via the talent Devour Matter. And we get an absolutely incredible quality of life change with the Dark Energy talent that allows us to move whilst channeling Void Torrent and move 20% faster while the Entropic Rift is active. And finally, with the Collapsing Void talent, when we cast Devouring Plague while our Entropic Rift is up, it increases both the rift's damage and size by 20%, and when the rift ends, it collapses, dealing a large amount of damage to all enemies within 15 yards. Though, unfortunately, this damage is split between all enemies, which really does take a lot of the punch out of it in AoE. There is also one major downside to Void Weaver that for me really does tip the balance a bit towards Archon, and it's that it uses Dark Ascension rather than Void Eruption. This is because the potency of Void Weaver lies in the 30-second cooldown Void Torrent, and Dark Ascension's shorter 1-minute cooldown just makes it far more optimal to take advantage of this, rather than Void Eruption's 2-minute cooldown. Archon, on the other hand, better pairs with Void Eruption, which is by far my preferred way to play. So, what's best? First and most importantly, I've had a lot of comments in my recent Shadow Priest videos with people worried that they're not going to be able to play their favourite hero spec. This is not the case, guys. Unless you're at the bleeding edge of the game, you're going for world firsts in the raiding scene or the highest raider IO numbers in the M+ scene, you can absolutely play either of these specs. They are extremely close, we're talking a couple of percentages in both single target and AoE scenarios. If you only really like the look of one, play it, master it, and most importantly, enjoy it. That is after all the reason why we play the game in the first place. But for those wondering which of the two is a couple of percentages ahead, currently it's looking like it's going to be Archon. In Mythic Plus, that enormous 2-minute damage window is just too much to ignore. If you can coordinate with your tank, or just understand where the big pulls are likely to be in a dungeon, the amount of DPS you can do lining up all of your cooldowns and trinkets is absolutely incredible. Combine this with the fact that Void Eruption makes it even easier to maintain your dots in AoE, as you get access to Void Bolt, which extends dot duration, the fact that you get more shadowy apparitions due to the combination of Manifested Power and Energy Cycle, and that 5% stamina, which will be so important when pushing higher keys. As a side note though, in lower keys with quicker, more frequent pulls, Void Weaver will be the better pick. In Raid, again Archon appears to be the better choice, pulling slightly ahead in single target DPS, though Void Weaver with its shorter cooldown damage windows and the ability to hit shielded targets really hard with the Devour Matter talent mean that it is going to pull ahead on certain raid bosses, particularly those with frequent ad spawns or any kind of absorb shields. I will stress again, however, we're talking a couple of percentage between each of these trees in both Mythic Plus and single target. For me, the way I looked at the choice was with gameplay in mind. I intend to play both Archon and Void Weaver, but right now I am leaning more towards Archon, and it is mainly because of what I said earlier that it gets to play Void Eruption rather than Dark Ascension. I will admit, however, that the class fantasy, the visuals, and the audio of Void Weaver are just far superior to Archon. In terms of some talent builds, for Archon, for single target, this is the recommended build, and then you change it slightly to look like this when you need Shadow Crash, so on a mostly single target fight with some ad spawns, for example. And then for Void Weaver, here's your full single target, and a couple of changes here just for when you need Shadow Crash. For Mythic Plus, I recommend this build for Archon, and then this build for Void Weaver. As with any and all information in a video guide, these talent builds are subject to change. Keep an eye out on places like the Priest Discord and Wowhead as we get further into War Within and Season 1, especially if there's any notable hotfixes or class changes. In terms of stats, it's not a good idea to blindly follow a stat priority over the course of a season. Your character's stat priority is going to constantly change every time you equip a new piece of gear and change your stats around. I recommend regularly simming your character. Personally, I use raid bots and the top gear sections compare new gear, or the Droptimizer section to look for your best possible upgrades. However, for a general stat priority rule, as always with Shadow Priest, you're going to want to prioritize haste, with mastery and crit being somewhat equal, and then versatility as your last prioritized stat. A note on versatility, however, if you're pushing high keys, surviving is the name of the game, and oftentimes it's worth dropping some DPS for more versatility in these scenarios. Again, sim your character and make changes based on your own goals and your own scenarios. For racials, in terms of any racials, with DPS we're talking minimal differences. You actually get far more impact from non-DPS racials, namely Shadow Meld for Night Elves and Stoneform for Dwarves. Stoneform was absolutely incredible throughout Dragonflight and far outweighed any change in DPS that a choice of race can make. My advice though, unless you're raiding World First or going for M+ titles, pick the race that you enjoy looking at most. That is the most important thing. But if I had to make one recommendation for Alliance and one for Horde, it would be Dwarf for Alliance, with an honourable mention going to Goblin for Horde because of the ability to rocket jump. For Trinkets, again, tuning can change at any time. Right now, tuning for Trinkets doesn't seem like it's finished, so keep an eye out on places like the Priest Discord and Wowhead and sim your character. But some trinkets that I've got my eye on include the Treacherous Transmitter, Spymaster's Web, and Overnax's Mercurial Egg, which are all from the Nerebar Palace raid. And then the Arakara Sack Brood from the dungeon Arakara City of Echoes, the Empowering Crystal of Anub Ikai from the Dawnbreaker dungeon, and an old favourite, the Unbound Changeling from Mists of Turnescythe. If I had to make an early prediction based on just an educated guess, we're going to want one on-use trinket and one regular equipped trinket. I'd say the Spymaster's Web and the Empowering Crystal of Anub Ikai are the ones to look out for. For our consumables and enchants, we're going to want to use the Flask of Alchemical Chaos, Tempered Potions, and for food, either the Feast of the Midnight Masquerade, or if you need personal food, then you can go for the Chippy Tea. The Authority of the Depths weapon enchant, Crystalline Radiance on our chest, and Sunset Spell Thread on our legs. Other enchants like Feet and Bracers don't affect your DPS, so you can change them depending on your needs. And in terms of things like stats on your rings, again, sim your character. Moving on to the rotation, things are incredibly similar to Dragonflight. Our core kit and base talents didn't really change that much, and we still want to abide by the same basic principles. Firstly, you need to be aware of your mastery. Your damage is increased for each of your dots on the target. This includes Devouring Plague, so maximizing your Devouring Plague uptime is key. Space out Devouring Plague casts, don't just dump all of your insanity at the same time, but also bear in mind not to cap on insanity and risk wasting potential insanity generation. Secondly, you want to maintain your dots and keep as good uptime as possible on them, particularly in AoE. Shadow Crash has a target cap of 8 targets, so you want to make sure that you're getting your dots on as many mobs as possible, and then keeping an eye on weak auras, nameplates to track these and not let them drop. Of course, if you're in a situation where there are so many mobs that dotting them all is impossible, then don't. But in general, and what I recommend, is that it's a good idea when you're making a big pull to start manually applying your dots with Vampiric Touch as the tank gathers the mobs. Then, when all the mobs are gathered, Shadow Crash and enter your proper rotation. Finally, always be casting. Shadow is not the most mobile spec, but you can apply skill expression to improve this. Make good use of your instant casts. Save your instant cast procs for a time when you know movement is going to be needed. Pre-position yourself in order to minimize movement required. Just try to ensure that you never have any prolonged periods of time where you're pressing absolutely nothing. Of course, our hero talents Archon and Voidweaver do change our rotation, so let's dive into how this looks with an opener for both trees. For Archon, we're going to want to either begin dotting manually with Vampiric Touch during a gathering mobs phase, into a Shadow Crash, or if there's no gathering phase or you're fighting a single target, go straight into your Shadow Crash. We then want to get our Shadow Fiend out, use all of our available charges of Mind Blast because these replenish when we go into Void Eruption, then go straight into all of our cooldowns. Halo, Void Eruption, Power Infusion, Potion, Trinkets, Racial, everything. We then want to get Void Bolt on cooldown, get a Devouring Plague up, use our Mind Blast charges again, and then into Void Torrent. After this, you simply want to ensure that you're being as efficient as possible with your abilities without letting any go to waste or spending prolonged periods of time off cooldown, and don't overcap on your insanity. For Voidweaver, things are quite different, mainly because we're using Dark Ascension and therefore we don't get our Refresh Mind Blast through Void Eruption. So again, you're going to want to start by either pre-casting dots manually with Vampiric Touch while mobs are gathering and going straight into a Shadow Crash, or just skipping the gathering stage and going straight into Shadow Crash. You want to get your Shadow Fiend, or your Void Wraith in this case, out, and then straight into your Dark Ascension with your other cooldowns like Power Infusion, Potion, Trinket, and Racials. We then want a Void Torrent, which will of course spawn our Entropic Rift, get a Devouring Plague up, and cast all available charges of our Void Blasts. Then we're back into that same cycle of simply being as efficient as possible with your procs and Insanity, trying not to waste any procs and trying not to overcap on Insanity, while maintaining as much Devouring Plague uptime as possible. One extra tip that I'd like to mention is the Power Infusion Focus macro. With the Twins of the Sun Priestess talent, we get to use Power Infusion on another player as well as ourselves. To make this easy, just right-click the nameplate of the player that you want to use your Power Infusion on and set them as your focus. Then change your Power Infusion keybind to this macro, and every time that you use this macro, you're going to PR yourself and the person that you've got as your focus. If you guys found this video helpful or useful in any way, please hit that like and subscribe button. A whopping 98.4% of you still aren't subscribed. I'm going to be streaming leveling with my buddy Hikase over on Twitch. I'll leave a link to my Twitch down in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you guys in Kazalgar.